Okay, good afternoon. I think I can begin. Once again, thank you for joining us in this webinar entitled Criminal Psychology, Understanding the Mind of the Criminal. I see about, excluding myself and my colleague from Aventis, there are about 34 of you, so pretty good crowd at this hour of the day. Some of you could be working at home, some on the move, right? So what I'm going to share today is some of my theoretical knowledge on a combination of criminology and psychology. So, criminal psychology is a subfield of psychology. Some also call it forensics and forensic psychology. Right. So, it's how we can use psychological principles to better understand um, the various areas that are studied by criminologists. I'm going to try to put this in very layman term. I'm not here to, give you some really advanced language about the criminal justice system. We're here to do a promotion for our professional graduate diploma in counterterrorism and security at Aventis School. And among the modules that the students will take as part of this program, one of them is criminal psychology. So it's like the odd one out because the rest are all on counterterrorism and security. But each time I run this course with the students, I see very confused faces sometimes like, oh, how come I'm studying psychology and, I thought I'm doing counterterrorism and security. So why do I have to understand the psychology of criminals per se? As the saying goes, a terrorist is a criminal, but a criminal is not necessarily a terrorist. Right? On the same note, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I think we have to put things into perspective. Another quote that I like a lot is an idle mind is a devil's workshop. Right. So some of these quotes typically get us very interested to look into the area of crime and its related topics. So I'm really here to share some conceptual understanding of the field of criminal psychology, uh, probably expose you briefly to some of the topics that we cover in this particular module, and why this area of criminal psychology is something that, everyone should at least have some basic knowledge to help us understand what crime is, the functions that it has in society, and more importantly, it's also about public safety and security, isn't it? A lot of us take for granted and think that security is a government's job and that it's not our job to uphold any form of security. So I think this will help you better understand behaviors and how behaviors work. A little bit about myself. My email address is there in case you need to reach me. I am currently an associate lecturer and an academic coach. So I'm a freelancer, so I teach at various institutions, both public and private institutions. Um, Academic coaching is something that I do in the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Something that I've been building up on, making full use of my counseling certificate that I have. My background is in sociology, and right after I completed school, I went to work, and a bit of my experiences. You can call me Anil, by the way. No need for Sir or Mr. Anil. I think I'm still very young, and a lot of my students who are uniform officers, they'll call me Sir, and then I'm like, hey, can you just call me by my name? I'm quite happy with Anil. They say cannot. It's a job hazard. Everybody is a Sir in the uniform service sometimes. Right. A bit about my experience, in terms of what I know about crime and why I have come to be here. Well, my dad is a former police officer in the Singapore Police Force. He served for about 25 years, won some awards for being the top investigator in his division. So since young, I've been exposed to a lot of police stories. right? Although some of these things are confidential, but as a kid, I was very inquisitive. I will ask, and at times I will eavesdrop his conversations with his friend, because back then we didn't really, well, there was no handphones. This was during the time of pagers, and you have landlines, and he'll be bellowing instructions to his guys, talking about cases. I mean, how loud can you get, right? So when I start to hear some of these things, I naturally got very interested, right? So my primary school teacher was a little bit concerned, like, hey, why is this guy reading so much about crime stories? Then I look at my teacher, I was like, don't worry, it's just an interest. I'm not going to do anything silly, right? A lot of people make funny assumptions. um, Lo and behold, I served my national service in the military, the Singapore Armed Forces Provost Unit. If I could say it in full, it's called SAPU in short, and I was a military policeman. But thankfully for me, I didn't have to go and be part of the active provost unit, flipping the rifles at the National Day Parade. My goodness, I was not really for that. I did very well for my military law, and I became an investigation officer in the Special Investigation Branch. This was like 20 years ago. And it was at that time where I got exposed to investigation and some form of on-hand police work. And it was just fascinating, right? To be able to come into contact with some of the things that I've been reading since I was young was just very fascinating for me. About a year and a half, I was so interested in it. I even won a letter of commendation for being the best national service investigator for cracking a few crimes. So I was like, wow, this is really good. Right. So a lot of people say that, oh, you're going to follow the path of your dad and go and be a police officer, much to the unhappiness of my mom. I shall not get into why my mom dislikes my dad to be a police officer. I think if you can piece two and two together, you probably understand why. He was hardly at home. The police station was like a second home. So if you are a woman and your husband is someone who's married to his job, I think you can understand and empathize with my mom. Right. So it went on. Somehow education intervened, and I stayed on. I had very good professors in NUS, and some were trained in this field of criminology. And I stayed on. I did my postgrad studies. I did my master's work on race, policing, and discipline in Singapore. Right. So did I want to join the police force? Well, I had the intention to, but somehow, through education and also being exposed to a lot of things, social issues and so on, I somehow ended up in the field of rehabilitation of ex-offenders, right? Particularly a halfway house. As you see there, I served for 5 years. Halfway house is a drug rehab center that seeks to rehabilitate drug offenders, particularly drug consumers. We don't deal with the drug traffickers, so drug consumers. So instead of releasing them directly from prisons into society, where there is a higher likelihood of reoffending, we are assuming that if we put them through an intermediary called a community rehabilitation center, and we offer them rehabilitation services, then release them back into society, there is probably a lesser likelihood of them reoffending. Right? Again, there's nothing certain, right? Do people who come into the halfway house go back into society, goes back to prison? Of course. There are a lot of them. I remember joining the halfway house once in 2010, attended a training session at the Singapore Aftercare Association, and a talk was given by an officer from the Central Narcotics Bureau, CNB. And the first thing he said was that, hey, look, nice to be with you all. Let's make this clear. You guys are the community people. I am the enforcer. We are both sides. We are on different sides. I do enforcement, I arrest, I catch people, and I stop them from using drugs. You guys take over after these individuals come out. And I was like, wow, was there such a important need to draw the line so clearly? And I then started to appreciate where a law enforcer or a narcotics officer is coming from, because he's coming from the point of enforcement of operations, and we are coming more from the side of, look, okay, this guy deserves a second chance, we need to help him, and so on and so forth. The mindset, to approach the offender was really different. So I was there for 5 years, really the highlight of my life. Made a lot of friends. It was tough managing individuals who were a lot older than me. Took me about 2 years to earn the respect of people who are undergoing rehabilitation. And I can tell you that drug addiction or substance addiction is not a laughing matter, right? People are even having difficulties quitting cigarettes, and you're talking about drugs, right? Nonetheless, I decided to move on. Wanted somewhere where my learning curve could increase, so I went to the Institute of Mental Health as a staff in the National Addictions Management Service, or NAMS, as you see. So in NAMS, I was doing something that I really enjoyed. It's called talking. So I was the mouthpiece at NAMS. I was the outreach manager. I went about, to schools, to community centers, to organizations, to government agencies, and talked about addictions. Here we looked at more addictions in Singapore: drugs, alcohol, gambling, internet, and gaming. I'm sure there are other behavioral addictions as well, but these were the few that we focused on. And again, in NAMS, I worked with offenders because many of those who came in for addiction issues had brushes with the law. And I started to realize that there are some patterns in individuals who run into some of these problems, right? The Singapore Prison Service, for instance, they have been looking in this thing called adverse childhood experiences, or ACES in short. And wouldn't be surprised that if you speak to many offenders and you do a psychological profile on them, you'll find that they have adverse childhood experiences. And I think there's a body of knowledge there to look into it, right? But on the surface, if I tell you that someone who has antisocial behavior and has offended has some adverse childhood experiences, you'll probably be telling me, okay, so what? Please tell me something new, right? That was my first impression. I think it's deeper than that. Not all criminals are the same, as I'll point out later. Anyway, that was my work experience there. So, you know, all along I was also teaching part-time. I was doing lecturing, and then in 2017, let me just do a little bit of adjustment here. Cannot be, oh yeah, 2010, I'm right. So 2010 onwards, I was doing part-time lecturing, but then in 2017 I took a leap of faith and I said that, well, I think I know where my happiness lies. My happiness lie in the classroom. So I decided to just do full-time teaching. My happiness in the classroom is currently being threatened, or has been threatened, by COVID-19, and now I'm talking to a screen, right? But still in the comfort of a classroom, you can't really see because there's a virtual background. It's different. When you walk into a classroom, there is an aura about it, right? But anyway, I'm happy to be here, and thanks for hearing me out on some of my experience. So besides this, I was also involved in several research projects with my professors, and to date, I still continue to read widely on issues pertaining to crime and criminal psychology. Now, when I went to NUS for my first term module, or level 1 module, Sociology 101, they call it, Introduction to Sociology. And this is 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲𝗃, a French sociologist, and he says crime is normal, inevitable, and functional. A certain amount of crime is an integral part of all healthy societies. And you could imagine the bewildered look of all the students, like, huh? Crime is normal? Are you trying to kid us? It's like we're checking our blind spot. Is there some clown somewhere around? What do you mean by crime is normal? How can crime be normal? Right? How can crime be functional? Right? And then we started to understand the functional perspective. And just to quickly summarize here, crime plays a function in society because it informs us what is crime and what is not crime. Punishment in the past used to be a public spectacle. Why? Because it's through this public spectacle that you are able to understand, okay, if I commit a crime, that's how I'm going to land up with. Right? Many years ago, we had a couple of high-profile corruption cases. One involving a senior SCDF officer, Mr. Peter Lim. Another involving a narcotics officer, Mr. 𝗟𝗋𝗀𝗲, who was later acquitted after he appealed. And these two individuals were involved in procurement issues. Right. So I recall one day, and that time newspaper subscription was still pretty good. I went to the newsstand and their two faces were splashed over the newspapers. And these pictures were bigger than obituaries. I was like, hey, these two guys didn't die. But the pictures were huge. And I was like, why do you need such a big picture in the newspapers? Well, basically, we're telling you that we have zero tolerance when it comes to some issues here, when it comes to such issues here. And I felt that it was also a message that is sent to other officers in the civil service and say that, look, watch yourself and don't get into trouble. So I think crime has a part to play in society, and Durkheim uses this word inevitable. You can't have a country with zero crime. If I can use a very cliche line that we use here in Singapore, low crime doesn't mean no crime. I mean, it's a tagline, right? So we understand that. So we're not looking for no crime. I think many countries are trying to keep their crime rates low, but that's the golden question too. Why are some societies, why do some societies boast low crime rates, and why in some societies there are high crime rates? I think we need to ask ourselves that. So, coming in to undergrad studies after serving in the national service, and then I got a sociological perspective, and I was like, hey, this is an area that is more than fascinating, and it has propelled me, and today the fire keeps burning. Right? Some intriguing questions that you may ask, and hopefully these are some questions that uh, can ignite some level of interest in you. Why do some people commit crimes? But instead of asking this really boring question, can I also ask a question, why do you not commit crime? I think it's always important to understand the flip side. It's like anger, right? So all of us have emotions. Anger is a feeling, and we all experience anger. So instead of asking the question, why do people get aggressive? The better question to ask is, why do people not get aggressive? Because from the point where you get angry to the point where you convert it to an action, i.e., aggression, there is something there. What is that something? Right? What is this gap in knowledge? Why did someone from angry became aggressive? But then there are some of us who from angry do not become aggressive, and we channel our anger in very different ways. Were we born with some of these capabilities? Are criminals born, or are they bred? Nature versus nurture. Is there such a thing as a criminal gene? Well, I'm sure there are studies on intergenerational criminality. I think recently there was an article released in the Straits Times about intergenerational criminality. I personally have worked with offenders, and I've seen a family of 4 or 5 brothers all having drug addiction issue. And in the same family, their sisters, no problem. So how can you say it's nature? Probably nurture. But that doesn't mean we ignore the biological aspect of an individual's DNA, for instance, because the nature can interfere with the nurture. So instead of saying nature versus nurture, why don't we say nature and nurture, and how the nature affects the nurture? The question then, is there a criminal personality? And can you profile a criminal? Touch on that in a little while, right? So that's the fourth. What are the strengths and limitations of criminal profiling? A lot of people are fascinated by that. Just maybe a couple of years back, I was watching this thing called Criminal Minds. I'm sure you all have heard of it, but not the Western version. I watched Criminal Minds Korean version. Very good. Okay, so if you're stuck at home, want to save more money, go and watch Criminal Minds Korean. Wow, bunch of good actors and some very chilling crimes as well. So don't watch it at night. Make sure you got someone to hug. Nobody to hug. Please, think of me or say some prayers, because those things, not spooky, but the nuances of the crime can sometimes give you a chill down your spine, right? So criminal profiling, is it good? What are its limitations? Is it effective? Right? And then we move on to some other areas where crime is not just about people committing crime. And this is something that I've been in for quite a while. My heart, half my heart is still in the rehab field. So hopefully next time, maybe a change back of heart, I might go back into that area. Can criminals, offenders be rehabilitated? And I think in this module, when I run it at Aventis, I also added another component. Can terrorists be rehabilitated? Clearly, the evidence doesn't seem to suggest so. And even if countries have programs for terrorist rehabilitation, doesn't seem very effective. Number one. Number two, we don't really have a sense of the data. Like, what do you mean by successful rehabilitation? Right? For crime, we measure this thing called recidivism. So if you don't reoffend within 2 years of your release and you reoffend after 2 years, you become a new statistic, right? But when you reoffend within 2 years, then you are known as well, it's reoffending. Now, 2 years, why 2 years? I mean, the government would have their own reasons, but what happens if someone reoffends 7 years later? What's the reason behind that? Right? Does it mean that rehabilitation has not worked? Right. When I went into the halfway house, that narcotics officer told me out of 10 drug addicts, one change. And my shoulders dropped. I'm like, okay, I think I'm in the wrong place. When I left the halfway house 5 years later, I asked myself, out of 10, how many change? Probably 3 or 4. Not bad. Not bad. It's not easy. But I had always friends questioning me, hey, Anil, I think you're better off in a better place. I was like, what do you mean? Does rehabilitation even work? Can criminals even change? Do drug addicts even change? Right? So these were some questions that I had to ask myself. Right? Why do some offenders and criminals reoffend? What is it? Is it the lure of the crime? Is it social circumstances? Or have they been wired in a particular way? Just like I ask myself, and many of my colleagues at NAMS would ask, why would a substance abuser relapse? Right? Why are certain behaviors also not criminalized? I think you can probably follow world news and how there are a lot of talks about, say, decriminalizing things like marijuana, drug use. I think in Singapore, we have decriminalized suicide. In some countries, certain behaviors are not considered unlawful and so on. So these are just some intriguing questions that I think people in this field would ask. Now, just some definitional pointers so that we all know what we're talking about here, right? Criminology is an academic discipline that uses the scientific method. So everything is a science. And sometimes, I get engaged in very short, what I call mini conversations or mini lectures in taxis and grab cars. I have a driving license, but I don't own a car. Don't find that it's necessary. And I enjoy my conversations with the drivers. And sometimes they'll ask me, hey, what's a social science? And I told them, well, you know what's a science? The science is not a subject. Science is a method of using experiments, observations, to collect empirical evidence to say that, hey, sodium plus chloride gives you sodium chloride. How the heck do you know that? You mix the two items together, there is a chemical reaction, and then you can conclude. So it's based on empirical evidence that we're saying that we're using science. So criminology uses the scientific method to study the nature, extent, cause, and control of criminal behavior. Psychology, on the other hand, is also science, systematic objective study of two things: mental activity and behavior. Mental activity, in very layman terms, refers to the mental processes of the mind. It uses five senses. If you have the sixth sense and you can see ghosts, good for you. That's not one of the five senses. Right? And our actions, our behavior. Right? So how does our thoughts, our perceptions, and so on convert into action? See, a lot of people get confused, right? They say that intention is the same as behavior, but it's a separate. And intention is the thing that comes before the behavior, right? So an attitude is an intention. I have a good attitude towards studying, so I intend to do this. And if my attitude is more positive, then I would probably follow up with some actions or behaviors that reflects my attitude. So an intention is not really a behavior yet, right? But we are quite interested to understand why people do the things they do. So behavior becomes the key aspect of psychology in term, or rather the preoccupation, because as psychologists, our business is to study behavior. I have this neighbor I always share with students. She's in her, well, I think late 70s now. She's demented, been having dementia for quite a while. Somehow or other, she recognizes me, and she's very friendly. So she'll ask me the same things when we meet. After exchanging pleasantries, she'll ask me, "Oh, what are you doing?" I say, "I'm teaching." "What are you teaching?" "Psychology." And her eyes will light up, and she say, "Oh, you can read my mind." I was like, "No, auntie, I cannot read your mind. I'm no mind reader. Fortune telling is a sham. But I can predict your behavior." And then she's like, "What's that?" I can explain why you do certain things you do based on some theories, concepts, and if I have empirical data, I can check for statistical significance. And after that, she looked at me in disbelief and she said, "No, you can read my mind." Well, I guess that's the lure of psychology. It's like a very sexy subject. Like, oh, psychology is you can read my mind. We're just in the business of really trying to predict behavior. Right. So I think you kind of get it. If I can marry these two together, then we have what we call criminal psychology. Critically involves the use of science, psychological principles or psychology as a science to advance our understanding of the causes of crime. So we're trying to understand criminal behavior, and specifically what goes on in the minds of the criminal. So two things here: the mental processes of a criminal, and also the criminal behavior or the actions that come out from it. Right? Now, one caution for you: there are different types of crime and criminals, which means it is conceptually wrong to homogenize crime and say that all crimes are the same, and here you go, this is a one size fit all model or framework to understand crimes. That's not going to happen. Now what you have here is a snapshot of various criminological perspectives, right? And these various criminological perspectives, all the way from choice perspective, psychological perspective, structural, and so on, gives you different explanations to why crime happens. For example, classical perspective would say that crime is a choice. The offender is a rational individual who calculates his actions with knowledge of the consequence. So if they commit a crime out of free will, then there should also be a system of punishment to deal with them. Because how then do we differentiate the criminal from the law-abiding person? Next, you have psychological perspective where they say, hey, let's understand the criminal personality. Let's understand levels of intelligence. Let's also ask ourselves whether the individual was affected by some mental incapacity at the point of committing the offense. Right, for the longest time, there is certainly a correlation between level of intelligence and criminal behavior. Right, just like, when 9/11 happened, September 2011, September 11 attacks happened in the US. The body of knowledge seems to suggest that there is a particular terrorist profile and that these individuals are lowly educated. They come from dysfunctional families, poor backgrounds, and so on and so forth. Socioeconomically, not doing very well. Fast forward, 2019 Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka. Who were the perpetrators? Educated gentlemen, rich. I'm just going to use a simple word, rich. They were well-to-do. And these are the individuals with a haversack walked right in and detonated the bomb. And you tell me that we can safely assume that a criminal has a particular kind of profile and that others cannot commit a crime. I think there's some limitations there. It might give you something, but it's not definite. Right? I'm just going to touch on one more here in the interest of time. I like the process perspective, and someone had just read my mind with a nice little green line below. Socialization forces. Who are the people who you come into contact with that has influenced your behavior? Because in psychology, we're not only interested to understand that individual's behavior per se, but we need to understand the individual's behavior in the context of society. So society or the social context, the environment, the situation, culture, other people, they affect our behavior. But we also have the power to shape societies in our own ways. Get a group of people, they can shape a particular neighborhood. And crime rates in that particular neighborhood can go up. Right? But I think who we come into contact with, the upbringing, early on I talked about adverse childhood experiences, all these should be looked at in trying to determine the causes of crime. Right? Moving on, this is a very simple framework to understand psychology. It says ABC. C refers to your thoughts, cognition. A, affection, refers to your emotions and your feelings. And B refers to your behaviors, which is really your actions. So the words on the right are very lay words to use to describe. Those on the left are more conceptual, affective, behavioral, cognitive. Very simple equation. Any action needs to be understood as a product of your thoughts and your feelings. I think psychology is the only social science where the starting point is the individual. And we look at the individual first and say, understand the individual, his actions, and then later on, we make that generalization across and say that, okay, people of this are likely to behave this way, and then we can understand society and people's behavior better. Right? So this is a very simple framework. Keep that in mind. Later, probably you can use this to relate to some of the things that I'm going to say. Now, so we predict behavior early on, as I mentioned, nature versus nurture. I think I'm not going to discount biological psychology. I think there's still that nature argument, the dispositions that we have, the inherent characteristics, the temperament that we have as individuals. But also, how do the environment and the situation shape us as you know, as humans. Classic experiment in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo. He calls it the Stanford Prison Experiment. Now, he was intrigued by two things. Why was there police brutality? And why was there prison brutality? Are these prison and police officers naturally violent? Were the officers who were responsible for George Floyd's death, were they naturally aggressive fellas? Or did the environment or situation trigger their aggression? Sometimes you read news. This individual lost his head, killed someone. Or caregiver of a father of a mentally disabled child lost it, threw the child down, committed suicide. People get shocked. I thought this guy is very nice. Every day he asks me how am I, whether I want some fruits and whether I have anything to eat. Oh well, so if someone asks you all these things, he's nice. Welcome to the world of the criminal. Not really true, but sometimes the environment and the situation can inform us on how behaviors have been shaped. Now, based on this nature nurture thing, here's Hans Einzek, 1964, if I'm not mistaken. You can read up a little bit more on him. He talked about a criminal personality. Well, he does a lot of other things. He even looked at things like race and ethnic relations. He developed a criminal personality, and he says that personality is biologically based. And he says that for a criminal personality, it characterizes people who score highly on three dimensions. One, extroversion. Extroverted, introverted, I think you know that difference between them. Although I feel that these are just labels that need to be really looked into. But extroversion here in the sense that he he generalized criminals to be people who are active, who seeks attention, who are sensation seeking, and they commit crime because they want to achieve this need of theirs to seek sensations, and because if they don't, then that need is not being met. They are also highly neurotic. Neuroticism here refers to emotional stability, right? So criminals in general, according to Isaac, are those who tend to be very emotionally unstable, right? So they're highly neurotic in that sense. They're anxious, you know, they tend to report low self-esteem. They may be depressed, although that's a very big word, and they have problems managing their emotions, right? I think that's not rocket science. Go talk to people who offend, try to understand their thoughts and behaviors, and you probably can make a good fit in terms of their emotional stability. Now, what was a bit different from Hans Isaac criminal personality is that he introduced this dimension called psychoticism, and he talks about aggression, antisocial behavior, right? Impulsiveness, that inability to empathize with your victims. Now, put together, this really forms a very strong criminal personality, right? But Isaac's work was also heavily criticized because it was too much of a generalization, and some has critiqued him in terms of whether he had credible data to suggest whether this model of looking at criminals could actually hold water. Right. So along the way, you had many different criminological perspectives coming in to help explain criminal behavior. But we just had to flag out Hans Einzek terms because he was one of the few who asserts that criminality was biologically based. Running out of time a little bit. Consider the following crimes: drug consumption and drug trafficking, nature or nurture, embezzlement of company funds. Most of y'all will say greed, opportunists, uh, stealing from a supermarket. Right. I think the media would have corrupted our minds. We have all different kinds of scenarios of why people commit crimes. Some would say desperate, no money, so had to steal food, right? That whole stealing of baby powder kind of issue. Now, someone could be stealing from the supermarket for fun. Lack of excitement, just go steal for fun. I just want to steal because I want to prove that I can walk out of the supermarket with the item, right? I'm not a terrorist, but I sympathize with them and I would like to fund them $350 for their publications on social media. I don't want to fight on the ground, but I want to go and join them in wherever they are fighting, and I want to cook for them. I want to fill their stomachs with love. I'm not a terrorist. Are you not? Financing terrorist groups is a very, very serious crime, and it's not about $1 or $450. A lot of people miss the point. But what's the motivation for that? Why do some people get radicalized by terrorist content and some don't? These are questions that we need to ask, and these are questions that you can follow up on to stir up your interest. When does murder become manslaughter? Right? Do we always throw the insanity card and say that, I was disturbed? Well, be it whether you have thrown the insanity card or not, as long as you are arrested for murder, you will be sent to the Institute of Mental Health for a psychiatric assessment, right? And voyeurism, very interesting area that has tons of news. Sometimes I wonder, like, hey, did voyeurism happen during my time? Well, we didn't have very solid cameras and so on, so impossible, right? But today, with the sophistication of technology, and I was reading just a news a few days back, this guy was, he had a pen camera, right? And he puts it at a pen holder in the sink so that he can film his friends showering. Sometimes I feel that if you want to be very good in this area of crime, or if you're going to do security, right, it's not about whether you get A, B, or C in school. It's really about how streetwise you are. What the heck is a pen holder doing in a damn toilet? The So no, then you're not inquisitive. You go there, you don't look out for props, you don't look around. And a lot of people think that voyeurism, right, that the victims are all females. That men are the lumpen gender, right? The creators of the biggest trouble, all the jerks. And men, well, true enough, 8 to 9 out of 10 people in prisons are male. Sorry guys, but we are the troublemakers. But have you thought that the victims of voyeurism can also be men? 2 days ago, there was a news of a national serviceman who was caught filming his fellow army guys showering. These days, when I go into the toilet, back then, we used to open newspaper, very big, and then we read, well, we are doing big business. These days, no, nobody brings the newspaper in the toilet, trust me. They are always on their phones. And when I read all these news, I get very conscious. So these days, when I'm doing big business, I'll be checking all the blind spots. Left, right, up, up, behind, no, it's a wall, but well, you never know. And I keep checking. So you're doing big business, you're doing this. Because all these things happen with technology and it's damn scary. Right? Now, voyeurism is very interesting. And sometimes when you read some of these cases, you just wonder, why do they do what they do? Right? There was a case where this guy went around condominiums. He stole, I think it was women's shoes or high heel shoes, brought it to one corner, masturbated, ejaculated on the shoes. Never mind, go and put them back some more, no? Very, very thoughtful criminal. Don't know what was it that turned him on, right? There must be something. And a lot of people think, or if you follow Hans Einzek, criminal personality, we say that they are very psychotic, they're highly neurotic, and so on. Well, I'm pretty sure if CNB officers will probably tell you that when they go on a raid and they try to enter a house, I'm very sure there'll be a struggle. Some of these drug abusers even take the chance and jump. hoping that they don't die or they escape partly injured. Well, some don't make it. But the interesting thing about individuals who commit all these upskirt videos thing, when they are apprehended and when you ask them over for the phone or say, I want to look at your phone, typically they don't resist and they don't run. I mean, logically, when you're caught and you have the evidence, take the bloody evidence, throw at them and run for your life or quickly run away, right? But these guys, no. Give me the phone. Nah. Wow, so nice. How come criminals are so good or offenders are, so nice to you? I think there's a little bit of a difference here when we look at different types of offenders. And because there are different types of offenders, I think profiling becomes very important. It's a relatively new area of forensic psychology that is based on increasingly rigorous methodological advances and empirical research. Right? Now, offender profiling is the process, if you can read the second point there, of linking an offender's actions at the crime scene to the most likely, very tentative, right? It's probabilistic, to the most likely characteristics to help or assist police investigators narrow down and prioritize a pool of most likely suspect. Look at how tentative this particular statement is. We're not being definitive here. We're not saying that profiling means I know who did it, unless I really have hard evidence that points me to that person. These days, with CCTV camera footage, you can easily nail down the evidence. But if you watch enough Korean dramas like me, right, what these Korean drama serials kind of tell me is that the CCTV footage cannot be trusted as well, because there are rich politicians and whoever that can doctor and manipulate these images. And that made me feel very sad. Like, oh, I thought that was like really solid evidence, and now you tell me you can manipulate them. What's the world coming to? Anyway, back to this. Perceiving non-verbal behavior such as body language, telltale indicators for suspicious behaviors. Right? I always get into very healthy, highly charged debates when I have members of the audience who are police officers, and I tell them that look, when you are profiling, you are using stereotypes. For example, race, age, presence of tattoos, gender, or even kids. Like how often do you check kids? Small little bugger carrying the Spider-Man bag or Hello Kitty bag, inside 0.5 kg of heroin. Do you know? You won't check, right? How likely are you to check? And how do you tell whether a child is suspicious? You can't. Very limited. I mean, these are some telltale indicators that a trained security personnel would have. But ultimately, in terms of trying to look out at who to stop and search, for instance, I think the probability is quite low. And, with the mind, and at one point in time, you're bombarded by thousands and millions of stimuli, I don't think you can process a lot of things. So, profiling by observations, quite limited. Right, quite limited. Well, of course, they have their own tools and so on, and they have cameras and data analytics and all that to help them, sure. But I think profiling is also about post-crime. So after the crime has happened, we've got the cases, we've got the statistics, we develop a profile of sorts of the offender. And I think this helps us with crime detection and prevention, as my last point mentioned. Right. Strengths, I think it helps policing to provide a basic framework for investigative information. It creates a heightened level of victim protection. Now, what the heck is that? If scams are affecting elderly and we profile elderly to be a victim, then we quickly shout to the whole world, if you are elderly, please beware. There are people who are going to scam your life savings. Okay, so victim, wow, wow, wow. Hey, oh, people, be careful, don't anyhow. If somebody call you, say from DHL or OCBC Bank or Ministry of Health, please ignore, don't give your 3-digit PIN. Okay, good, victim protection. It's a helpful resource for serious crimes as well. Right? Now, there are also certain downsides. Too many assumptions. Did a person steal the milk powder out of desperation or for fun? How do you ascertain that? It is based on consistency. Offenders who understand the logic obviously will change their style. I mean, how dumb do you think the offender is? The offender can be a very shrewd and clever person. It didn't take long for terrorists to realize that they were targeting people with beards. So what did they do? They shave their beards. Oh, it's not rocket science too. They understand the security systems. They will beat the security system. Right? Perpetuate stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Some people tend to be disproportionately stopped and searched by police. And this is a whole body of knowledge on race, crime, and policing, particularly in Western societies. Go read up about America and policing. Right? The perceptions of profilers, the person who's doing profilers may be biased too. Right? Sometimes we are affected by our own emotions and our own thoughts as well. Now, some key takeaways. I think criminal psychology helps us to understand the motivations of the offender. Offenders' behaviors and action, are they inherently antisocial, or really they're triggered by environment or situation? Now, with that, I guess punishment will be different for them. Rehabilitation will also be different for them. I think that's very important. Beyond the observable, right? We need to develop a psychological profile of offenders, right? Because as I shared with you, that there are limitations of observing people, and I think we also need to understand. Sorry, I'm just typing something to Ling Ling. Oh, should I have sent to her personally? Okay, never mind. Um, Beyond the observable, we need to develop that profile so that that profile will help us to better understand future crimes. Operationally, profilers need to be aware of their biases and suspend them. I think this is work in progress to develop this very good tool or framework to do profiling. And as I shared, it also helps us to consider ACES, adverse childhood experiences. Well, I just wanted to quickly end off on a positive note. I think rehabilitation offers some level of hope. Rehab is really the process of re-educating and retraining those who commit crime. It uses psychological approaches to target the cognitive distortions committed by particular offenders. And it also involves general education like literacy skills and work training. In short, the focus is not on just the person's behavior and their actions and their thoughts, but it's also social in nature. So I'll use the word psychosocial aspects. And really, the humble goal is to reintegrate offenders back into society. So I think, rehabilitation does offer some level of hope. If you're wondering what can I do in this field, well, look at the relevance of psychology all around. I might have even missed out some points here. There's so many fields, and those that I've highlighted in maroon effectively fall in the realm of criminology, sociology, as well as psychology, right? These are some areas where you probably can have an interest in. And if you are trained in security, psychology, and criminology, you probably find yourself in one of these industries. Well, I have stretched a little bit, and I just wanted to thank you for listening up to me, and hanging around listening and taking time out of your busy schedule. That's to learn and to get some information. Now, before I look at the chat and see if you have any comments or anything, in case you need to find out more information about this program, you can contact Ling Ling from Aventis. Her numbers are there. 720-3333 is the office number. There's also a mobile, 9151-3308. You can drop Ling Ling a text, or contact her, maybe schedule an appointment to find out a bit more about the program. Please take note that the programs run on weekends. So that's how we typically conduct our lessons. And I think there is a February 2021 intake coming up, and you get a little bit of grant from signing up. Right. Ling Ling, do you want to add anything? I still have a little bit of time.
Sure.
Mm.
Thank you, Anil. I'm Ling Ling from Aventis. Thank you for sharing with us this important topic. I'm sure everyone who has participated learned a lot from you. Then, if you need informations about this course, more about the graduate diploma in counterterrorism and security, please feel free to drop me a note. I will be sending all of you the brochures and the course schedule. Then more information will be made available through email tomorrow. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you,
Bye.
and yep. All the best. Have a good weekend ahead. A good week and weekend ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Anil.
Thank you, Ling Ling.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.